North American history is crazy because, for whatever reason, North America does not seem to have any real ancient human history. So, by that I mean, if we look around the rest of this planet, what do we find on basically every other continent? We find potentially, thousands of years old civilizations that have left, ruins or megalithic ruins all over the place. Right? Every continent you go to, Africa, Asia, Europe, doesn't matter where you go, South America, etc. Literally doesn't matter. For whatever reason, everywhere you travel on this earth, we seem to find broken down megalithic ruins scattered all over hell and back. But when we come to North America, for some weird reason, there's nothing here. Now, I live in North America, so if I say like our history or my history, that's because I'm obviously here in North America. But it's weird because when we go to study history, we go to Egypt and there's all this crazy stuff sitting there, right? All these awesome mysteries, crazy ruins. We go over to China, same stuff. They have all that they have pyramids over there as well. No matter where we go, like there are huge ancient megalithic sites. But when we get to North America, everything changes. For some weird reason, North America not only doesn't really have any megalithic ruins, nor does it seem to have any semblance of any really truly ancient history. Now, I get it. There are those of you right now who are saying, yeah, but what about, all the American Indians that lived here, right? They're ancient. They have all this stuff, don't they? I mean, at least they have an ancient history. Here's the interesting thing about all of the North American Indian tribes. I say all of them. I'm going to say like 99% of them because I can't technically speak for everybody because I've not read every single tribe's, information and stuff like that. But when you go and you actually listen to and read real North American Indian history, and I mean the real stuff, I'm talking about the stuff that was truly held sacred, right? The oral traditions that all of these tribes tried to keep alive throughout the centuries, right? And maybe even a millennia or so. But even that chronology gets weird. It's probably not that long. Anyway, when I'm talking about looking at North American Indian histories, I'm talking about going and trying to read and find the information that was told by the people like 100 years ago or so. The reason why I point this out in any capacity whatsoever is that, in my opinion, as far as I can tell, the older recorded North American Indian traditions are probably going to be more reliable than anybody telling the stories nowadays. And the reason for this is very simple. It's not because people got stupid or anything like that. The reality is, if you live in a Western society, if you live here in North America, you have been exposed to ungodly levels of propaganda and psychological conditioning, and social conditioning as well. This is a reality that we all live in the West. You can't get away from it. So, when you go and you read a work that is trying to talk about something in our ancient past or whatever, or people are trying to record what their ancestors told them, the reality is we have to keep in mind that anybody writing nowadays is going to be influenced by modern culture. And modern culture has absolutely purposefully poisoned the well when it comes to North American tribal history. And you don't have to take my word for that, by the way. There are plenty of actual, like, real Indian shamans out there from various tribes, if they're still alive, who corroborate all this. I mean, this is their words, basically. I'm not making this up. I got this information from actual, tribal shamans that actually care about their history. And all right, so here, let's frame it a little better. If you go and you listen to the older folks, the older people who are trying to carry on these stories, and the reality is a lot of them are dead now. So you have to, you got to kind of dig. You can find some video interviews, and those are always good. The older, the better, basically. So when you go and you listen to or you read whatever these shamans were recording back in the day, one of the problems that they all agree on is a huge issue within their culture is that the younger generations simply do not care about the oral traditions. Right? And you can find this everywhere. It's not just North American Indian tribes that complain about this. It's cultures all over the planet. The reality is, right now, the day and age that you and I live in, you know, real history is just being lost because people are losing interest in it. How do you like that? So if North American Indian tribes basically recorded their history through oral tradition, that was quite common. You know, it's common all over the planet. But any culture that carries on their history and their tradition like that, you know, one of the main problems with oral tradition is that once people forget, it's gone. I mean, there's no recovering an oral tradition if it's not written down. So, you know, obviously the shamans and the elders, etc., they rely on the younger generations to show up and then carry, you know, grab the flag and carry it forward. No one wants to do that, right? Especially in Western society. Because the reality is, everybody, you know, Western society offers a lot of distractions, and it really makes, you know, carrying on an oral tradition not all that interesting, right? And so anyway, you find this problem with shamans and stuff like that talking about this problem all the time. So I just say that because when we start to look at North American history, and if you go and you crack open a very recent book or something like that, you have to keep this in mind because it's entirely possible that anything that you are reading that is newer in the published realm is going to probably just be missing stuff. Or even worse, and once again, this is straight from shamans and things like that, you know, the history is being altered. I mean, the history is being changed by modern Western propaganda, and that's just a reality. And you know, anybody who really looks at things objectively, you can see that it's not hidden. You know, there's no special secret here. It's obvious what's going on. You know, well, it's not obvious to everybody, but once you start taking history seriously, it becomes obvious. Anyway, I know I'm going off course. My main point is this: when we look at North American history, we have very little to go off of. Like I said, if you look at other continents right now, you know, you can find all kinds of amazing monuments. Hell, you can even find writing carved into said monuments, right? I mean, we actually do have access to a lot more than we sort of think we do. When we look at North America, we don't have any of that. North America is essentially a blank slate when the Europeans discover it, or when the Europeans, I shouldn't say discover it, because, and yeah, I know everybody's going to be like, well, this person discovered it back in 10 billion BC, and that guy discovered it in 20 bajillion BC. You know, I'm not going to get into those semantics. What I mean is that when Europeans start arriving en masse, what they find is a continent that is essentially fresh. You know, when they get here, there's untamed forests, there are untouched rivers and lakes. There appear to be resources essentially everywhere, and they're easily accessible because it looks like nobody has touched anything. And the reality is, this is one of those things that made North America such an attractive prospect to basically everyone all over the planet, because suddenly news started to spread, you know, back in the early, 13, 14, 1500s, whatever, that there was an entire continent full of resources that had very sparse populations of humans there, and the resources are untouched. Now, we take this for granted nowadays. Nobody really thinks about this, because, and there's a couple of reasons why. The first, and probably the main reason why everybody takes this approach and finds it acceptable and doesn't question anything about the freshness of North America, is that the way mainstream chronology and anthropologists and historians, etc., the way that they have it all set up for the masses, the general population, is that for whatever reason, you know, humans only started breaking out of their evolutionary shell, 10,000 years ago, basically. So mainstream chronology literally believes, and this is what anthropologists and mainstream historians, etc., they honestly believe that humans existed like you and me right now between 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, right? So you and me, like no, not, weird monkey people, nothing like that. Mainstream makes the proposition that we existed like you and me 100,000 years ago, but we did not do anything for 90,000 or 190,000, depending on what side of the coin you're on that we did nothing for basically 90,000 years. Nothing. Humans just sat around, stared at rocks, scratched themselves, and literally just went ooga booga for 90,000 years. It's the notion is ridiculous. The concept is insane. That is not how human psychology works. That is not how humans operate in general. Humans are movers and shakers. Humans are problem solvers. And back then, if this is real, back then there would not have been all this horrific propaganda assaulting everybody's minds every 2 seconds, so people would have been generally more productive, right? And because in theory there wouldn't have been as many humans, so every single human would have been able to play a larger part in their society, which means the people would have been moving around and doing things, right? Nobody would have been sitting around for 90,000 years doing nothing. It's the most ridiculous concept that anthropologists maintain. And of course, historians back it up, right? Historians have no problems with this, saying, oh yeah, only about 10 or 8,000 years ago did humans suddenly decide to start building huge megalithic structures on scales that are absolutely unimaginable out of nowhere. Like that, this is fine with these people, right? You look at ancient Egypt. There's no, well, they try to spin it, but there is no real build-up to building pyramids, right? The pyramids literally just appear. All of that amazing stuff that we know Egypt for, that stuff appears out of nowhere. There's no slow progression that we have. We have no evidence for that. It's literally nothing then, here's pyramids, bro, and then that's it, right? Here's the Sphinx. Here's all these crazy statues, right? Here's these gigantic megalithic structures out of nowhere. I mean, it just magically appears. It's literally like that in the mainstream chronology. It magically appears out of nowhere. Now, I know there's a caveat to the Egyptian thing. What mainstream Egyptologists will try to say in that regard is they'll try to say something like, well, they started with the step pyramid, then they built the bent pyramid, and then finally they got to the, they try to make it sound like there is a progression there. There's not. We have no evidence for that. There is no scientific basis in any of those claims, and there's no reason to believe it anyways. There's also no reason to believe that things like the bent pyramid or the step pyramid are lower levels of garbage architecture anyways. Because when you go inside these things, there's some pretty serious construction going on inside of these pyramids. So it's not just a bunch of, Egyptian monkeys running around, throwing mud bricks on top of things, hoping something works. Now, these people knew exactly what they were doing, right? The ancient Egyptians, whoever the hell they were, they knew exactly what they were doing. Anyway, but that's the situation that we find in history. So when people look at North America, especially if you're, Westernly, classically, Europeanly trained, like me. Europeanly, is that a word? No, I don't think that's a word. It's a word now. No, it's not a word. Anyway, if you're Europeanly trained, like we were in the West, decades ago, basically, we didn't question the concept of Europeans showing up in North America and finding this essentially untouched continent. It made perfect sense because if you used mainstream chronology, everything seemed to flow without issue, right? It makes sense. Oh yeah, North America shouldn't be touched because there was just a few North American Indian tribes living here and they lived with nature, so they didn't do anything, right? So nobody questions anything. Everybody just thinks, oh yeah, this is good. This all makes sense. And then history goes on from there. This right here, the fact that nobody questioned this, the fact that none of my teachers questioned this aspect of the story, the fact that it wasn't even a thought in anybody's brain to be like, wait a second. So let me get this straight. We have people all over this planet building all kinds of structures, etc., for the past few thousand years, before Europeans show up on the North American continent. So we have all these people doing all this stuff, and it's all kinds of cultures, races, etc. doing all this stuff. But for some weird reason, North America remains untouched, simply because the North American Indians, they lived with nature and would never have done anything against nature, right? And this is the way that it's played off, and everybody just nods their head and goes, yeah, that makes sense, and then we move on. This is a serious problem. This is actually a serious humanistic, psychological, evolutionary problem. And when I say evolution, I mean in the sense of how humans grow, within a community, how humans progress technologically. I don't mean, us losing tails or whatever and turning into hairless monkeys. That's not what I mean when I say evolution. I'm not going to use that term again. Anyway, so nobody questions this. It's fine. It makes sense, right? You have North American Indians. They live off the land. They apparently don't touch anything. They're perfect. They do nothing wrong. and then Europeans show up, and then everything starts to go to hell in a handbasket. And there's a little bit of truth to that, I get it. But it really does beg the question, what the hell was going on with the North American Indian tribes? First of all, that's a basic question. And then, of course, the next question we need to ask is, are there any truly ancient histories in North America? And if there are, what the hell are they? And if they're not, or if there aren't any, why not? Like, it's a legitimately weird problem. So this is what I want to talk about today. I want to run through this thought process because it's incredibly fascinating that North America is essentially this unbelievably fresh continent. Right, it's just amazing. It's this bastion of resources, and everybody takes it for granted. Like it's just normal. Like this is like there's nothing weird about this at all. I beg to differ. Now this is what I want to go over today. I probably said that like 3 times already, so let's get to it. The main question is this: why is North America so fresh when it comes to natural resources? And why is this continent with so many resources essentially empty? I mean, this is a legitimate problem that we have in history, because if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, it doesn't make any sense. All right, so let's go down this rabbit hole and let's see what we can figure out, because the reality is, I'll give a small spoiler, the answer to this question actually goes a long way into proving that Earth suffered some fairly serious cataclysmic events on a cosmological scale only a couple of thousand years ago. Right? So if we're going to make catastrophic claims, we really are going to need some pretty insane evidence. Interestingly enough, North America fits the bill for some of the most insane evidence that proves catastrophism, among other crazy things that we'll talk about as well. All right, so let's do this. So let's put on our critical thinking caps. It can be a giant foam cowboy hat. I don't care. Whatever you need to do, go slap your neighbor, steal his. You do whatever you want, but put on your critical thinking cap. And let's start asking basic questions. And let's see if we can use logic, reason, and science and history. And let's see where it takes us. Because we actually do need to solve the problem of why North America is essentially untouched, even though humans existed for 100 to 200,000 years in our current physical state. Right? The capabilities were supposedly identical, if you listen to mainstream. And we'll just stick with that for now, because that really makes this whole situation funny, because it makes the mainstream look absolutely ridiculous in their claims when we analyze it, just a little bit. Okay, so we have a problem. It does not appear that North America has any kind of ancient history. So, but is that true? But is that a true claim? So where can we even begin to get some of this information? Well, let's ask the people that the Europeans ran into, at least, right? I mean, regardless, we know for a fact that the North American Indians were here before the Europeans showed up. Or at least that is what the mainstream tells us. There's actually a lot of crazy stuff happening in history that is being suppressed right now. Right? And a lot of this stuff, by the way, will come straight from the mouths of American Indian shamans, etc. So this is not some sort of weird, the stuff going on in today's day and age is horrific. The programming, the propaganda, it's destroying society. And I don't want to get, caught up in any of those arguments. So I'll just be blunt. A lot of the evidence that we are going to go over comes straight from the mouths of the oral history from North American Indian tribes. All right. So if you don't like what I have to show you and say, don't argue with me. I didn't say it. I didn't come up with it. This will be literally the stories that the Shoshone, the Paiute, etc. These are their stories. I'm just reading, and I'm just gonna, relay what they say. All right, so just a warning, really quick, before anybody starts, getting their butt puckered up. Okay. Anyway, so let's go ask them, because they were, at least as far as we are concerned, they were here. They've been here for a little while, right? So let's see what they have to say. So when we go and we start looking into what the North American Indian tribes had to say about ancient America, it gets really interesting. Because one of the first commonalities that we find relative to North American Indian tribes is they all have a, not all, I won't say all, I can't specifically say that, but the vast majority of them will have a story that goes something similar to this. They were straight up, they were like, hey, we migrated to North America only a little bit ago. We have not been here for 10,000 years. We have not been here for 1,000,000 years. Not only do their stories talk about how they came to America relatively recently, another similarity that we find between a lot of their stories, and once again, it's going to depend on the tribe and the tribe's age, because don't forget, there are tribes that are relatively newer creations relative to the older tribes that showed up. Like, tribes split over time, etc. So don't forget that. Whenever you go and you start looking at North American history, you have to remember that, every single tribe that existed by the 1800s, for example, may not have existed back in like 1100 AD. Like that's exactly what happened. Tribes split up. Okay, anyway, you get my point. Anyway, the interesting thing about the older tribes, the original tribes, let me use that term, is that their stories are all similar for the reason why they migrated to America. And they all say they migrated. No one says they originated in America. Or I should say almost no one says that. I can't say 100%. But a vast majority of their stories talk about how they were all either fleeing from some crazy god cataclysm, right, caused by the gods, or they were fleeing from some horrific war that was taking place on some other part of the globe. Now, those stories are unbelievably amazing, and they actually go a long way into explaining other parts of world history. I'm not going to get into it. I just want to set the stage for everybody to understand that the North American Indian tribes that we are aware of today, and the way that the mainstream looks at them, they are not ancient for like 10,000 years. They were not here that long. And we know they weren't here this long for a simple reason. We have no archaeological proof to prove it anyways. So not only do we have the tribes themselves recounting the fact that even they are relatively new, we have zero, and I mean not a shred of stratigraphical evidence that would prove that the North American Indian tribes, as we know them now, existed, 10,000 years ago. There's none of that stuff. So right here, we can already make the conclusion that mainstream historians are crazy. Mainstream historians and the way they present the chronology, they're 100% scientifically wrong. And there's no way around it. Like, even just talking about this for 2 seconds, we can immediately get rid of mainstream chronology. This is important because we have to figure out what the hell was going on in North America in the past, and we cannot be bogged down by lies and propaganda and all that garbage. I mean, that is literally what mainstream academia does. It's funny, in fact, if I personally was a North American Indian, I would be unbelievably offended like none other the way that mainstream treats North American Indian tribes. Like, you go and you watch some of the presentations about the rock art and stuff like that. Academics literally think of North American Indians as cavemen. I mean, they treat them like these low-level people. It's unbelievably insulting. Anyway. Point is that North American Indians are relatively recent. So when we go to look at and question, their history to see what kind of information we can get about ancient North America, the reality is their perspective is only so old. And they tell us that it's not that old, right? They have no problem telling that. So that kind of puts us in a conundrum, because right there we're already at odds with mainstream chronology, right? I mean, if the Native American Indians say, hey, look, we migrated here before you guys got here, yes, but we are new as well. So that kind of puts a hamper on our studies, because now it's like, all right, well, crap, how far back can we truly look now at ancient America? What the hell was going on 4,000 years ago? So when we start to look at the North American Indian stories, they become really interesting, because one of the things that a lot of them discuss, and it's a huge part of their history, and I mean an integrated part of their history, is they say, hey, when we got here, there were already people here. This is something that is made very plain and very clear if you go back far enough into the North American Indian tribes' histories. They very plainly tell you, we were not the first people here. There were already people living here when we got here. Now, just to quickly silence anybody who thinks that this is not true, it's even funny. You can actually Google the question, who was here before the North American Indian tribes, and they'll actually give you an answer. And it's funny because they literally say almost 1,500 years before Native Americans arrived in the Americas from Siberia. God knows how historians put that together, by the way. The Northwest was essentially populated by early Europeans. Now, isn't that crazy? How even the mainstream nowadays has no choice but to acknowledge the fact that the North American Indians were not the first people here. Now, that's not bad or anything. The only reason why I put emphasis on this is because most people's understanding of North American history is essentially there was nothing, then there was Indians, then there was Europeans, and now here we are. Like that is literally your basic the understanding that everybody has of North America, and that's completely false. That's completely wrong. Now, I'm not saying that this little blurb that I just looked up really fast on the mainstream website is correct either. It's not. I mean, like I said, we have no reason to believe that anybody was wandering around 15,000 years ago, right? That date is suspect, extremely suspect, right? And I'm not going to tear into that right now. But anyway, I just wanted to point out the fact that, nowadays mainstream historians, they can't deny this. So, okay, great. Then that means we have ancient people potentially inhabiting America. Okay, so we're looking good. That's a great piece of information for us to go off of when we try to figure out what the hell was going on in North America, way back in the day, like when the pyramids were being built, or, well, I hate to even say that because we don't know when the pyramids were built. Basically, what was going on in ancient America 5, 6, 10,000 years ago? What was happening? What was anybody doing? All right, well, at least we've established that there were people before the North American Indians. The next question we have to ask is, what was going on? I mean, what were they wasting their time doing? Because once again, when we look at the North American continent, we don't find huge megalithic structures anywhere, at least initially. I get that you guys can argue with me, but hold on, bear with me. I want to set up a good, solid foundation for where this is going to lead us. All right, fine. Who the hell were these people that came before the North American Indians? Well, let's go ask them again, because they would be the closest to those people. Because, I mean, their stories talk about being around or coming into North America and then having to deal with the current inhabitants. Now, this is where things can get rocky. And the reality is, this is a lot of the stuff that we could cover right now. We don't have time in this show to cover, so I'll just cover the kind of basics. When you look at the North American Indian tribe history, what you find that they don't run into just one kind of people. There's actually several different kinds of people already living in North America. And all right, here, let me just say it, because this is their stories, right? This is their histories. A couple of examples are this. When they arrive here, one of the things that they have to deal with, or one of the kinds of people they have to deal with, they call these kinds of people giants. That's their words. This is what they call them. These people are 8 to 10 feet tall, according to the tribes. I'm just saying what they are saying. When they arrive in North America, some of the tribes have to deal with giants that are already living here, apparently. So, okay, that's interesting. Then it gets crazier, because the histories actually talk about the interactions that they had with these giants. And the interactions range from really, really positive. So much so that according to their histories, they actually integrate into each other's tribes. Like, that apparently happens. But then there's the opposite side of the coin as well. Some tribes have to deal with essentially animalistic giants. Giants who are, well, to be blunt, they're man-eaters, right? They go out of their way to eat the tribe people, right? You have both sides of this dichotomy show up in their histories. Now, is this real? This is, I'm not going to say definitively one way or another, but it is their history. So if we are going to take, North American Indians seriously, which we should be, we should take their story seriously. If they ran into taller humans in North America, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's what we are going to do in this show. We're just going to say, yes, whatever these guys basically say, there's at least a kernel of truth to it. But I mean, why not take it completely serious? I mean, why not? I mean, if they migrate to North America due to some sort of a cataclysm or a war, that's interesting, scientifically viable, scientifically possible. It's not weird, right? Okay, great. You get the hell out of Dodge, you come over to North America. When you get here, there's stories, they say, hey, look, we get here and the hardships continue because then we have to start fighting these huge humans. Like, you know, and it's a problem. Like, this is not some sort of like a side story to scare children. I know it gets turned into that later on. But the way the initial histories are told, they are told in the way that really goes out of its way to show that these were legitimate problems. That these giants were attacking the incoming, you know, North American Indian tribes, and they were brutal to them, and they had to fight back. Like, they were going from one war to basically another war, not in the same scale, not even close. But when they look, you know, the way they tell their history is that they're just exhausted initially. It's like, we tried to get away from all of this crazy, destructive violence. We show up in North America and we're fighting again. I mean, and it's it's this enemy that's just brutal and ruthless, and they have to deal with it. And the stories really talk about them, you know, being affected by and these supposed giants changing the course of their history. Now, in that case we just discussed, it's bad because those giants, they kill, eat, slaughter, etc. Not good, right? So, you know, there's tension in the air over there. But then there's the flip side. We also have tribes discussing and talking about how other Indians integrated with other giant tribes. You know, okay, interesting. Once again, none of this is unscientific, by the way. The only thing that gets weird is the biological human scale. There's not technically anything wrong with a 10-foot human. We've had them, you know, they exist nowadays. Do we have a 10-footer now? I don't know if we have 10-footer. You know my point, right? It's not impossible to have a huge human, but there are biological and, you know, scientific problems when it comes to size, right? You know, the inverse square law is a problem. It's not something, you can't just say, oh yeah, you know, 20-foot humans were walking around and yeah, it's all good, bro. You can't really get away with that without having to deal with the biological science. So, you know, anyway, I'm sort of getting off track. Okay, let's refocus. Okay, the point is that North American Indian tribes substantiate the claim that somebody was here before them. Okay, cool. Let's take that and let's run with it. So the next question comes, all right, well, who the hell really were these people? I get that the stories are talking about giants and stuff like that. But where are the traces of these people, right? If the North American Indians, they arrive as latecomers, what were the people they run into doing the whole time in North America? What was going on? Did these people leave any traces? Once again, we can ask the North American Indian tribes, or we can also just look around and try to find stories of stuff that Europeans were finding as they started to explore North America. And sure enough, we actually do start to find some very interesting structures that cover essentially all of the eastern half of the United States. And these are these gigantic mounds of dirt. These gigantic mounds of dirt, they're just called mounds, the mound people or whatever they call them nowadays. Right? This is known. We know for a fact that these are all over North America. The problem is that mainstream historians give credit to the current North American Indian tribes for building these mounds. The problem with that is that once again, those same tribes, if you go back and you listen to their histories, they are very specific about saying we had nothing to do with building these mounds. Like they say, they don't take any credit for it. They're not, they're very respectful of them mostly, depending on the tribe and the situation, but they don't take any credit for it. That might change nowadays. You can probably find, unfortunately, people taking credit for them nowadays because, like I said, remember, we live in a Western world. Western world has absolutely twisted everybody's entire perception of history. And like I said, also, the shamans lamented that the newer kids wanted nothing to do with the real history. So basically, there's a really good chance that whatever you're reading that's brand new nowadays is really a good altered version of the truth. right? So you just got to be careful. Anyway, if you go back and you look at the really ancient stories, the original recordings, writings, etc., this is what they say. They don't take credit for it. Now, I know you can say, yeah, but didn't they find like 1 or 2 Indian burials in these mounds? Yes, they did, but those are called intrusive burials. The bodies that they found that were relegated to a North American Indian race, those were only buried like, 6-7 feet into the mound on the side. Those mounds were not built for that person, right? And that makes sense because they stuck the body on the side of the mound. They did not stick the bodies in the bottom center of the mounds. We know this because we have actually found tons of bodies at the bottom and the center of these mounds, and interestingly enough, almost every single report of those bodies claimed to be 7 to 9 feet tall. Very fascinating stuff. I'm not going to go crazy into this direction, but this is the history of North America. Something was obviously going on in North America's past that is not jiving with today's history and chronology. So something has to be wrong. Somebody is lying somewhere. And it's obvious that the mainstream historians are lying. I mean, that's it. We'll just call them out for what it is. We'll discard their garbage, and we're just going to move on with this, all right? Okay, so back to the question. And I got to stay focused. The main question here is, why is North America so fresh? Okay, so let's look at those mounds really quick. If those mounds were built by the people that came before and maybe lived during, the time of when the North American Indian tribes, came into and lived in America, how long did those people exist in North America? Why do we only find their mounds on the eastern half of North America as well? These are just interesting questions, and some of these we're not going to get into because that's not really the question I'm trying to answer. Okay, you know what? I know. I got to focus. Okay. So why is North America so fresh? So it's a problem because now we have 2 different peoples, at the very least, that we know, who were living in America. The people that came before the current Indians, and then the Indians themselves. When we look at this, we have to ask ourselves, what the hell's going on? If we have all these people living in America, North America, why is it that North America seems so pristine when the Europeans arrive? I mean, the tribes and the people that came before them, they had to have been there for maybe at least 1,000+ years, right? That's plenty of time for humanoids. I'll just use humanoids because I don't know who the hell the people technically may have been. Well, there's various peoples. Anyway, I'll just say humanoids. That's plenty of time for humanoids to exploit and extort, the land around them, right? They would use those resources in theory to build up their civilization again. We don't really find evidence for that, do we? Like when the Europeans arrive, everything is basically seems like everything is untouched, right? We only have scattered tribes of North American Indians, and that's all that's left. This begs the question, why? What the hell happened to the people that were before the American Indians? And why are the American Indians themselves not exploiting the land to the level that they potentially could have? Right? And don't make no mistake, by the way, the American Indians are fully intelligent people. They could have exploited the land in all kinds of ways. And the reality is they did. They did exploit the land here and there, right? But they just did it on a low level, not only, and a respectful level. I guess we'll say a respectful level as well. But that doesn't mean that they would not have eventually expanded into exploiting the land like every single other culture on this planet. Right? It's only a matter of time, probably. And this is the key, time. How long does it take humans to expand beyond, a small border and start realizing they have to exploit more and more resources to keep a growing population supported? This is a legitimate scientific question, and it actually may be key to why North America is so fresh. So let's look at it like this. The reality is humans expand exponentially. There's no way around this, right? We can right now use observational evidence to prove that humans just explode in population, and it doesn't matter where you're at. It literally is irrelevant so far as a human is concerned. What am I talking about? So one of the things that a mainstream scientist or historian will say is they'll say, Well, their populations did not grow huge over the course of 1,000 years, because they just didn't have access to the kind of medicine that we have today. Everybody lived until about 30 years old and then they miraculously died, right? This is literally what historians and scientists say. They say, hey, look, everybody just died at the age of 30. One or two dudes may have lived to be like 60, but that's it. Everybody died young, basically. We have no evidence to support this whatsoever. That is purely conjecture. That it is, make no mistake, that claim is one of the dumbest claims you can imagine coming from a historian or a scientist. Let me prove why. So right now, we can look at any part of this planet. Doesn't matter. Not any part of this planet, we will find populations essentially exploding. Except for, I know, in certain Western areas where the propaganda has hit certain peoples really hard. Different subject. If you don't have propaganda stopping people from procreating, let's put it like that. If you just leave humans to their own devices, what happens is humans will exponentially procreate and it will absolutely outlast any kind of mortality rate. All we have to do is look at any, third world country, essentially. What do we find? Do we find their populations dwindling? No, it's the exact opposite. We find these people who do not have access to Western medicine, generally speaking, their populations are they're just exploding. I mean, there's nothing to say about it, right? I mean, this is the truth. There's nothing, these populations are growing like wildfire. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. My point is, from a scientific perspective, anyone who wants to claim that people died young because they did not have access to medicine, that's a dumb claim. It is 100% false, and it is backed up by zero science, and in fact, it's actually disproven by observational evidence. Like right now, we can look around and we can prove it. We don't need anything else. We're done. So anybody who wants to say that, the North American Indian populations were held down for that reason, for example, stupid. Make it even funnier, these people, the North American Indians, they weren't dumb. They had access to natural medicine. They knew what they were doing to the best of their ability, right? They were rocking and rolling. They were fixing stuff. They were solving problems. They knew what to do when they needed to do it. So nobody was dying that young constantly. And also, nobody makes this claim either, by the way. When you look at ancient oral traditions, stuff like that, nobody talks about how everybody dies at 30 years old. There is no story like, oh yeah, man, when you get to like 29 years, you just die, bro. That was just common. Nobody has these stories because it wasn't happening. It's just stupid. Okay, so I just say all of that because we have to factor in population growth when we look at the people who were here before the Europeans showed up. This actually goes a long way in clearing up a problem that we are going to have with respect to how long have people truly been living in the North American continent. So if the North American Indians had lived here for like 10, 20,000 years or whatever, their populations would have been huge. When the Europeans would have arrived, there would have been sprawling encampments of people because the reality is they would have had time to exponentially grow. So, this is key. That means that since there were only scattered, sporadic tribes around North America, this is proof that they did not have time to procreate at that level, which means they have not been here that long. Now, once again, their stories corroborate all of this stuff, so it's not a big deal. But if you want the scientific evidence, this is one of those pieces of evidence. Population growth. It's not there. So that means that at the very least, the North American Indians would have been incapable on a logistic scale of exploiting the land at that level anyways. They couldn't have done it if they wanted to, right? We even have stories about, them lighting fires, lighting entire forests on fire just to get, kill some animals and stuff like that. That's a legitimate thing. That was done. But even at that scale of destruction, it made no difference because North America was essentially untouched still. I mean, everything was forest, everything was essentially pristine, and there was tons of it, right? It's just everywhere in North America. You small Indian tribes were irrelevant relative to the size of all the resources around them. They could burn an entire forest and it would be irrelevant, right? Because there was 20 bajillion more forests that you could go to. It just didn't matter. Right? They had an Eden, essentially. Anyway, so what we find ourselves is in a situation to where anybody who wants to try to make a claim that the current North American Indian tribes are the progenitors, of the, past 10,000 years or whatever for North America, that's false. Okay. But what about the people that came before it? What about the mound builders? What the hell happened to them? Very good question. Very good question. And once again, the North American Indians tell us, they say either they died out or they literally left or they were killed off in wars. Those are the three main points. The interesting one is that some of these just leave. They go, quote, back home, unquote. It's a very interesting story. Not for this. But anyway, so at some point we actually do have the stories of how the original population disappeared. Let's just say that. They were gone. Right? And that population left some of their remnants, which one of those things is the mound builders. Right? All those mounds everywhere are attributed to the culture that existed pre-North American Indian. Okay, interesting. But what does this have to do with trying to figure out why North America is so fresh? Right, well, if we've proven that the North American Indian population did not have the time to, exponentially grow, that proves that they are relatively new. Right? They couldn't be more than maybe at best 1,000 years old, but probably not even that old at all. In fact, for sure not that old at all. What that essentially tells us is that when the North American Indians arrive over here in North America, they also find an essentially pristine land as well. Right? That's why they came over here and decided to settle, was because it was way better than the area that had been hit by a catastrophe and or was, embroiled in a huge war. Right? So they come here, everything's peaceful and happy. Yeah, sort of, until they run into supposed giants and other races and stuff like that. Different story for a different time. But that means that America was essentially fresh because nobody was exploiting it. I guess this actually leads to another problem because now, well, I guess that also proves to one degree or another that the people who were before the North American Indians, they also were not exploiting North America either, maybe. That might get a little weird, but it also begs the question, how long were those people living there before the North American Indians migrated over? Right, now that gets a little fuzzier and I don't have a good answer for that. So, okay, fine. So we're at a point now to where we can say, all right, so there were people living here, but the histories of all of these people does not appear to be all that old, right? So this is important. That means that humans, for whatever reason, only just started arriving in North America, apparently, in the past 1,000 years or so. So America had not had time to be exploited, but things get weird because we also do actually find some megalithic ruins in North America. The interesting thing about the North American ruins is that the ruins that have been found are severely buried. And I mean severely buried. And nothing is sticking out on top of any of these sites, generally speaking. We have some up in northwestern America. There's a couple of sites up there, and I know people can argue that maybe they aren't megalithic, and I'm open to that. But the interesting thing that we find, though, is that these structures... Oh, there's also, like, the rock wall down in Texas. That's another interesting thing. It's buried. Once again, it's buried. We do apparently seem to have some sort of evidence for an ancient potential megalithic situation. Now but what does that do for us? Like I said, I don't have any direct proof that any of those things are legitimate, first of all, even though there probably are, but the science is not 100% yet, so I'm not going to jump onto that claim. But it's interesting to see that there is the potential for that. Then it begs the question, why the hell are these things buried, right? I mean, why is all this stuff buried? And another thing we can look at is we can say, hey, look, the megalithic structures, the potential megalithic structures are buried, but the mounds that we find are not. The mounds, whoever the mound builders were, they could not have existed too long ago because their mounds were only overgrown to a point. Right, so the mound builders and the North American Indians were probably, they were contemporaneous at some point until the mound builders disappear and leave or whatever, and then the North American Indians, take over the occupancy. But whoever the hell the megalithic builders were, like, we have nothing on those dudes, and so okay, great. But the interesting thing is that they're buried. Okay, fine. So we can at least prove now that the people who existed before the Europeans were not here that long. What that means is that something must have happened on the American continent to have stopped other humans from fully flourishing and exploiting it like all of the other continents were. You know, it's a legit question. Why is America so untouched? So that leads us to the next point, or at least the next scientific point that we can start looking into to start to try to figure out what's going on. Why are humans so new, or at least seemingly new, to North America? So let's start looking at, I don't know, geology. Let's start looking at nature and stuff, right? Because we can at least make an attempt to try and date something if we start to look at stratigraphy and if we start to look at just the basic biological growth of trees and stuff like that. And I'm not talking about dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is trash and should not exist. What I'm talking about is that we can look and see how old are like the forests, for example, in North America. Do we have 10,000-year-old forests? Do we have 1,000-year-old forests? Or are a lot of the forests that the Europeans run into, for example, are they only a couple of 100 years old? This is actually one of the main scientific points that we need to explore. So one of the interesting data points that we have is that we can look back at the records of the Europeans coming over, and we can actually see areas that were not forested that are forested nowadays, right? I think a lot of people look at forests in today's day and age, and they think those forests have been there untouched for like thousands of years. I don't think a lot of people really appreciate that the vast majority of the forests, especially in North America, they're not that old. Right? They're only a couple 100 years old at best in certain situations. Yeah, there might be one or two that are like 400 or 500 years old at this point, but they are on the rarer side. A lot of the vegetation that we witness and see today did not exist 500 years ago. It was not there. There was no such thing as a forest in a lot of areas that have forests now. Right? And even more to the point, we actually have forests that have been deforested and then regrown back within the space of a couple of 100 years since the Europeans have arrived. The point in saying all of this is that what we can do is we can look at the tree growth and we can say, why are we not finding forests that are like 6,000 years old? Where are the 2,000-year-old forests? Where are these ancient forests? Because we know that the the North American Indians, they were not exploiting the forests on an industrial level. It doesn't sound like the people before them were doing it either. And it actually begs the question, were those forests even around back then for them to exploit? They may not have actually had anything to exploit, which may, oh yeah, that might actually make the mounds, maybe the reason why the mound builders built the mounds was not just because, a giant, huge pile of dirt would be a pain in the butt to rob, but because they didn't have access to trees and stuff like that because there were no forests at the time. Yeah, what if that's why the mound builders ultimately went with mounds, because dirt's everywhere, but trees, logging, etc., not so much. Right, we don't find ancient wooden structures around America. I know, not that ancient wooden structures would really last all that long, but you get my point, right? I mean, there's not even a potentially ancient piece of wood here in America that would point to any of the civilizations that would have been the precursors of the North American Indians, for example. Right? We don't have that kind of evidence. It's kind of weird that we don't, because you would think that America, being, as forested as it seems to be, would have stuff like that all over the place, especially if we are going to admit that humans have been here, relative to the mainstream especially, for 15,000 years, right? Where is the evidence for 15,000 years worth of an occupation? We don't have anything like this, right? We don't. The only evidence for any real occupation, and I mean scientifically based evidence, I mean evidence that you can actually prove. I'm not talking about the pseudoscience garbage, all the radiometric dating trash and the, whatever dendrochronology garbage. I mean, like, something you can actually prove, right? We can only say that American civilization, the people who've lived here, we can only say maybe at best 1,000 years ago, and that's at best, right? And I'm probably being pretty generous, in all honesty, but I'll just say that for now. So that begs the question, why? Why is it that humans only seem to really start moving and shaking about 1,000 years ago? What is it that kept humans back? What stopped all the original inhabitants from becoming some sort of a glorious empire, right? You see empires all over the planet on other continents, right? We have countless wars going on between all kinds of people because they just outgrow their boundaries, right? Their borders just continuously expand as their populations expand, and that causes problems. So why didn't that happen in North America? Because we really don't find that kind of evidence over here in North America, even though we know that people were here. What this shows us is that these people must have been hampered in some way or another. Something had to have stopped the humans in North America from really exploiting and growing. I mean, something had to stop them, right? What was it? What the hell gets in a human's way? Now, we've already discussed the population problem and the medicine situation. That is not a scientific excuse. Humans will still expand regardless of access to modern Western medicine. So that's not a problem. So what the hell else can get in a human's way? Right? Okay, maybe sickness. You could say, well, maybe there was a huge plague that, constantly raged over North America. You can say that, but we don't have any evidence for anything like that. So that's not really a good, you can say it. I mean, it's not a bad proposition, but we would need scientific evidence to prove it. We don't have it. Okay, so we can get rid of that. What about wars? Would there be any huge wars that could have possibly happened in North America that killed the populations on that scale that would have held them back? We don't have evidence for that either. We definitely have evidence of battles, and that's a different show, but nothing on the scale that would be required to truly hamper multiple populations of people and keep them down. So there's nothing like that. We have no evidence for that. What else could it be? Well, all we have to do is listen to our ancestors' stories, and we know exactly what happened. So let's start listening to the stories. When we start going back in everybody's histories, what do we find? We always find the gods fighting in the sky. When the gods are fighting in the sky, the people on Earth generally have to feel and deal with the fallout. Now remember, these stories are told all over the planet, and the North American Indian tribes also have some of these stories as well. The reason why they may not have direct stories on some of these with respect to North America is because all of them were not in North America at the same time. Only some tribes may have potentially witnessed some sort of catastrophic event that took place on planet Earth, that affected planet Earth, and that absolutely annihilated North America. Because we need some way to stop human development on the continent. Somehow we got to get rid of it because it's not here. We don't find it, and that's weird. Even though we know there were human populations here, the Europeans do not show up and they are not greeted by armies of millions of other inhabitants. It doesn't happen like that. North America, for some weird reason, is very fresh. How do you get a landscape to be that fresh? Right? That's the question we're trying to answer here. So we're going to look at the mythologies of those that came before, right? Let's look at our ancestors' mythologies. Do we have any histories of something happening to planet Earth that would have essentially wiped clean entire vast areas of the planet? Right? Because the reality is, to keep humans back, you need something amazing like that. Because humans do not stop moving. I know you can look around nowadays and maybe say the opposite, but once again, we live in a completely different, problematic, I don't want to use that word. We live in a troubled time that, as far as I'm aware, has never been seen before in history. So it's a little different. If humans are free to move and shake, humans will progress, right? There's no way to stop that. Well, I guess there is a way to stop it. If you can figure out a way to kill humans en masse by the tens of millions in one night, you will definitely hamper population growth. You will absolutely make any kind of progress almost impossible. But how do you do that? Well, let's look at our ancestors' stories. Do we have anything in those histories They talk about times to where entire civilizations were wiped out by something capable of doing that. And of course, yeah, we find this everywhere all over this planet. We have catastrophic stories infused into every single culture's history on this planet. To make matters even more crazy, we find that quite a lot of everybody's stories around the world actually sync up. Yeah, it gets absolutely insane. Anyways, so in the North American area, what we need to do is we need a way to not only stymie the human population, we have to keep them down somehow, or wipe them out, potentially wipe them out. But we also need to figure out why North America has such fresh new forests. Why is all of the geography so fresh, so new, so untouched? I mean, if nothing happened to the continent for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, like, mainstream geologists say, they use the theory of uniformity, one of the most stupid things you can imagine, right? If there was nothing crazy going on, why don't we find extremely ancient biological habitats? Why don't we find extremely ancient anything on North America? Once again, if we start to look at the histories of the oral mythologies, etc., of all of the people who came here back in the day, they actually start to explain all of this. The problem is that, their explanations, they don't line up with mainstream science. They don't line up with mainstream history. So all of those academic institutions completely ignore the fact that all of these mythologies, or, the reality is these are histories. Mainstream ignores what these histories are telling us. And a very crucial part of these histories is the catastrophic nature of what they are describing. If the catastrophes that are, basically carried out by the gods on humans on Earth are true, suddenly America starts to make more sense. North America starts to make more sense. Suddenly, if we listen to those histories that say, hey, look, a huge mountain of water rode over the continent and took out everybody, suddenly North America starts to make sense. If we listen to the histories that say, out of the sky we had fireballs raining down on us. We had oil in some cases, bitumen raining down on us. We had earthquakes like you would not believe happening at our feet, and we even saw mountain ranges rise up overnight. Suddenly, America being fresh starts to make sense. Because if any of that is true, that means that the American continent went through one hell of a destructive situation. The American continent would have essentially been shredded. When you start to listen to the really ancient North American Indian tribes and their history, and the histories that they learned from the people before them, things get insane. So let's look at it from that angle. What if the stories of the earth flipping over a couple of times that the ancient American Indians tell about is real? What if, the gods in the sky that, switched sides, and as they switched sides, they created the Rockies and they created the Sierra Nevadas? What if that's real, right? What if Coyote in the sky causing the destruction that he causes is real? Now, a classically trained person will immediately say, hey, those are all just stories, buddy, right? That's all just made up fiction by the North American Indians because they had no other way of explaining nature. Right? This is literally how mainstream academia looks at these tribes. They think they're idiots. And the reason why is because when they hear things like crow or coyote or something doing something up in the sky, obviously to the classically trained mind, that makes no sense. There's no coyote in the sky, right? Things change a little bit when you take the concept of a dog in the sky and you use comparative mythology, and you find that for whatever reason, all kinds of people all around the world, for some, they also talk about a dog form in the sky. So why? What the hell is going on? Now, that's neither here nor, I'm not going to go crazy with that direction. My point is, is that when we look at North American history like this, it's corroborated by the rest of world history. So when people start to talk about major destructions, and they are using the very same or similar iconography in their stories, we have to pay attention to that. Especially mainstream people, because, you know, this is a problem for mainstream. Mainstream holds that nobody was in communication with each other up until recently. So the question of why does everybody have, generally speaking, very similar iconography in their mythologies, you know, that's a question that mainstream historians don't want to touch, because they have no answer for it. Like, there's literally no good answer for it. But just because mainstream people are dumb, that does not mean we are dumb. We can still ask good questions, and the main question we need to ask is any of this catastrophism that all of the ancients talk about, is it real? Because if it is real, that may actually explain why we find North America in the situation that the Europeans find it when they arrive. Basically, we find ourselves looking at this possible scenario. We have to somehow explain how an entire continent started over. We got to do that. We also have to explain why we find an extraordinarily amount of odd geology on the continent of North America that does not line up with mainstream academia's perspective with respect to how the geological processes work. Right? We have supposed old strata sitting on top of brand new strata, and that brand new strata is not that old. It's only a few thousand years old, according to mainstream geology. How does that happen? How do you get ancient strata on top of new strata that's only a few thousand years old? And we find that in multiple parts of the world, by the way. Right? We find entire areas up in the western part of North America, or I should say United States. That's a huge lava field, almost 1,000 feet thick. And this lava field is also not very old. When we start to look at the geology, which we should, because hey, we got to try to explain what the hell's going on. It's one of the scientific aspects we should look at. We find all kinds of weird stuff that does not line up with mainstream. If we listen to the eyewitness testimonies of the ancients, suddenly some of this stuff starts to make sense. Now, I'm not going to get crazy with all the other we'll do shows on that later, because I'm already running way longer than we should be. But what if these cataclysms actually happened? Right? We have insane stuff going on in all of these stories and all of these mythologies. Right? We have mountains of water rushing across the continent, for example. If a mountain of water was pulled across the face of North America, that would probably do a pretty good job of cleaning out whatever was there before and opening up brand new space for new forests and new growth to occur. If North America was hit by the kind of earthquakes that the mythologies talk about the gods creating, that is also another next level of destruction. And then, of course, if we take into account the stories of how the mountains were created by the gods up in the sky, you know, that's a level of destruction that would easily allow for a blank slate. And so it seems that North America actually goes a good distance to proving catastrophism, because North America is not old in any respect or in any shape or form. The geology is not old. You know, the life on this continent is not old. You know, we just don't have any sense of ancient stuff going on here. If we had major cataclysms rushing across this continent, that would explain why we see what we see. For example, I know this might sound a little schizo, but the reality is, go on Google Earth or something, look at North America just from a geological perspective. Turn off all the borders, do all of that stuff. Look at North America and look at the geology. North America is absolutely just screwed up. It's twisted, it's bumpy, it's flat in weird areas. I mean, it literally looks like, you know, just something just absolutely ravaged and crushed the entire continent. We don't really look at it like that nowadays because we're so used to these geological features. You know, but the reality is, if you take an objective look at it, the entire planet, in all honesty, the entire planet Earth is just one messed up hunk of rock. I mean, the Earth has been just torn apart, twisted, shaken, just crunched up. I mean, it's gone through hell, and we can see that. Like, it's there, it's right in front of us. And our ancestors talk about it as well. So the reason why North America might seem so fresh is that because all of the stories that our ancestors tell, they're not stories. They're actually recounting what happened. And to make it even crazier, this stuff only happened a few thousand years at best. At best. We may actually be living in the fallout of one of the last catastrophes. Now, I'm not saying that more are coming, at least more in the sense of what our ancestors went through, because the reality is that stuff's not going to happen because we do not live in the same solar system configuration that our ancestors witnessed back in the day. That everything is just different. So we don't really have to worry necessarily about this stuff happening again. But isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that if we take seriously the mythologies of our ancestors, and then we look at a continent like North America, and we look at it objectively, and we ask questions like, yeah, why is it untouched? You know, what the hell is going on here? Why do we find a situation to where nothing is going on, and people arrive and are able to just find everything fresh? How do you get to that point? Right? Humans don't, humans naturally exploit. That's what they do. Sorry, I know that's hard for some people to hear, but that's the truth. That's human psychology. That's what happens. Anyway, so what the hell creates an environment to where, North America is fresh? There are very few people living there. Like, that's another thing. We find such a sparse population by the time the Europeans arrive. What kept those populations down? And the tribal histories tell us. It's all there. So is that the answer to the question? Why is America so fresh? Is it because I don't even know if the mainstream even pays attention to this potential problem, but it's a problem. It's a legitimate, this is an actual historical issue we need to answer, because it holds the key to understanding how everything flowed back in history. And I don't see mainstream historians acknowledging any of this at all, right? They use the theory of uniformity. They'll kind of skirt around the subject to the best of their ability, and they never really talk about it. But we have a lot of problems in North America. Most of these problems are fixed or addressed by simply listening to the histories that our ancestors tell us. So is that why the continent of North America is the way it is? Are the stories real? Right? Is this what happened? Was the North American continent wiped clean and essentially reset so that the survivors, or the new people that came over, essentially had to start from scratch? That actually explains the population numbers that we see. It explains why we don't have any ruins around here. It explains why, if we do have ruins, they are extremely buried. It makes a little bit of sense of the mound building culture in that, well, I already said sense. In that sense, you know what I'm talking about. All right, these questions all start to find very interesting answers once we factor in the stories, the eyewitness testimonies. All right, I'm done talking. It's been an hour. We're finished. There's a lot more to cover here. We could go on forever on this, so I'll cut it here. But we'll go over each one of these topics in an entire show, because all of this stuff, it's so important to look at and understand, not just for North American history, but for all of history. Because like I said, everybody's, all of these stories, all of these mythologies, all of these histories are connected, right? Comparative mythology exists because we have noticed that they are connected, right? And we are getting results from comparative mythology. So when we look at North America, we might actually be able to find new pieces of the puzzle which explain a lot about our human history. Yeah.